Thank you so much for that sloganeering, although I could not make any sense out of it. But I presume that it is an expression of solidarity for the life lost and the utterly bad things that has gone wrong in the state of Manipur. I must first of all thank the HRF for this signal honor for having invited me to address the 14th memorial event of Balagopal, who I personally admired as a scholar, and someone whose work has also influenced me in ways at looking at sub-nationalist movement issues of civil society, issues of political mobilization at the grassroots. Having worked on Telangana, I had a project earlier, and I had a piece on politics of state formation on Telangana. I also had an occasion to had a comparative study of Bodoland with Telangana movement in another piece that I wrote as a part of my Liverhume project. I saw some of some of your leaders who are spearheading the Telangana movement. Professor Kodandaram is there. Really delighted to meet you after such a long time. I interview him as well, and I also interview quite a host of other people. It is such a pleasure to share some of the things that is quite intimate to you, not only on the personal front, but also as a scholar or an academic who try to make sense of issues of conflict, issues of autonomy, issues of accommodation, not only in Manipur, in Nagaland, in Assam, in Mizoram, where I had done extensive field studies over the last 20 years. I also have an occasion to involve in larger project looking at issues of conflict, issues of state formation in other deeply divided places. So what I intend to do here is to share some of my thoughts, although rudiments of my thoughts have appeared in various national media, in Hindu, in the Indian Express, in the Tribune, or other news outlets where I have published around 13 pieces on the current Manipur violence. And to reiterate the points that I have flagged in my writings, let us be clear about one thing, that this is a classic textbook case of institutionalized riot system, which the political scientist Paul Brass has competently fleshed out in the context of other communal riots in North India between the Hindus and the Muslims. Although there is a caveat and a distinct difference in that, although religion is one of the undercurrent factor which undergird this violence, in effect, they are far more complex regions of factors which played over time and which the political dispensation in Manipur since 2017 in effect exploit in order to subserve their narrow partisan electoral interest. And this is where I argued in my opinion piece in the Hindu, in the Indian Express, in the Tribune, as well as in the Quint and other outlets, that the role of the state, both the central as well as the state government, has been pivotal, given that we now have increasing signals from the Home Minister saying that the Chief Minister has been cooperating. So if you take on face value the statement of the Home Minister that the Chief Minister has cooperated in maintaining law and order, why is it that a double engine sarkar or a double engine government which aspired to be a superpower, had not been able to contain violence on a localized scale for the last over 5 months, which in effect suggests that the state has not been politically willing to contain violence at the very outset, right? We do not need second guess about the intent or the seriousness of the state, both at the center as well as the state government, especially in the context in which more than 60,000 central paramilitary force had been deployed over and above the existing state machinery, which is directly given the power to handle violence in the state. So if more than 60,000 paramilitary force cannot extirpate or contain violence for over the last 5 months, it tells something deeply disturbing, which in a way, in effect, throws very uneasy question on the central as well as the state government in terms of their seriousness in addressing the complex political or structural violence that is at work behind this violence. So instead of addressing the problematic at hand, which is essentially the pivotal involvement of the state in laying or in preparing the grounds for this violence, in sustaining it for vested partisan electoral purpose, and also providing post facto rational justification of how this violence perpetuates. So the kind of narrative keep on changing, as you'd see, and the latest edition of this is the Home Minister intervention during the no confidence motion in the Parliament, where he suggests that this violence was perpetuated by one nondescript militant organization, the Kuki Democratic Front, based in Myanmar, which in effect was debunked by the Kuki National Organization Burma unit, saying that such an outfit, militant outfit, has never been formed or never exists. So much so that this narrative has gained momentum subsequently, and as you know, this Home Minister intervention was sometime in 9th August. And on 27th September, the External Affairs Minister, Jai Shankar, in his press interview with the Secretary of State of the United States of America, in their briefing in the Council for Foreign Relations, suggests that migration is one of the major issues which in effect cause this violence, without alluding explicitly to the involvement of militant organization, which again was reiterated most recently on 1st October by the Chief Minister, by suggesting that this violence has nothing to do with communal conflict between the Métis and the Kuki zone, nor is it a law and order problem, but he suggests that it is the handiwork of Kuki militants based in Myanmar and Bangladesh in connivance with Kuki militants based in the hills in Manipur, which in essentially suggests that the entire blame is casted somewhere else, which in effect does not square up with some of these political statements that the Chief Minister himself made. For example, in 2018, when during the India Today enclave, the Chief Minister of Manipur was in effect recorded stating that there was no immigrant or migrant in Manipur. And just within 1 year, he changed track, and he suggests that in alignment with these vigilante civil society groups in the state, that illegal immigrants across the Indo-Myanmar border, specifically alluding to the Kuki Zomi groups as the major source of destabilization in the state. But if you really look at the statistics or the data that the government of Manipur itself, in effect, put up in public place, you'll find that the chief minister constituted a cabinet subcommittee headed by a Kuki, led Pao Haukip, whose house was burned on the very first night of the outbreak of violence, although his house was located just 4 units away from the chief minister's residence. And this subcommittee found out that there was around 2,174 illegal immigrants who were detected by the state cabinet, and out of which hardly around 154 were found to be in Churachandpur, which we call it as Lamka, right? So in a sense, there is a lot of inconsistency in what the chief minister say over time, because they do not square up with his own government records on the one side, and also on some of the specific data publicly available for mass consumption. That's one. The second point, which I think we have to be mindful of in order to make full sense of the nature and character of violence in Manipur, is this narrative that it is the result of narco-terrorism, right? So again, the government of Manipur has in its own public documents, which is the Superintendent of Police, Narcotics and Border Affairs, suggests that between 2017 and 2021, you have around 2,438 cases of drug-related arrest, out of which the Kuki chain accounted for something like 824, that is 33.8%. The Meitei Pangal, that is the Muslim community, accounted for 1,067, that is around 43.8%. The Meiteis accounted for 367, which is around 15%, and others accounted for something like 180, that is 7.4%, which in a sense suggests that all communities, all major communities in Manipur are implicated in drug tests. That's one level of engagement. The second level of engagement could be that the inappropriate use of narco-terrorism, because after all, you have a combination of 2 syllables, which is narco, which is illegal use of drug or illegal manufacturing of drugs, and another one is terrorism, right? So if you look at these two, combination of words, they are deliberately selectively used in order to target a specific selected community as the problematic other, which in a way is unacceptable, because in the first place, Churachandpur, that is Lamka for example, or Kangpopi, is not known for a manufacturing hub of all these illegal drugs, as it were, right? It is recently that you start having small pockets of limited production. It's never mass scale production that happens. It's elsewhere across the border. The counter argument is that there is a perceptible shift in the manufacturing hub of these illegal drugs across the Indo-Myanmar borderland from the Thai, Laos, Cambodia, Golden Triangle, and which the vigilante groups in Manipur, in cahoots with the powers that be in Manipur, now begin to peddle this very notorious idea, suggesting that one community in Manipur, that is the Kuki Zomi groups, are solely responsible for this drug menace, as it were. And that precisely explains why one of the leading frontal civil society organization in Manipur, COCOMI, a coordination committee of civil society organization, in effect declared a war on narco-terrorism. And in fact, these provide the backdrop in which there is an aggressive as well as offensive and unrelenting target of waging war against specific communities in the foothills. And this is precisely what people should really, be cognizant about, because the contextual condition and actually existing conditions are starkly different. And the second part of these, selective use of words, narco-terrorism, is terrorism. So the kind of narrative, official state narrative or civil society narrative based in the valley in Manipur that you hear is that Manipur, or for that matter, national security threat essentially stems from the Kuki terrorist, quote unquote. Terrorist is a heavy and loaded term, as it were. And in fact, the Kukis are not terrorists. In fact, they are militant armed organizations which have entered into suspension of operation agreement with government of India since 2015, which essentially implies that all these Kuki militants, the 20-odd Kuki militants, ragtag militant groups with very insignificant or inconsequential arms power, are already domesticated when the violence broke out. And to suggest that these 20-odd militants, which is insignificant in numbers, insignificant in terms of the arms or ammunitions that they have, pose a grave threat not only to the security of the state or to India's national security, is above board. It's a bit exaggerated. But if you look at closely, you'll find that instead of the Kukis, it is otherwise, that in Manipur you have 7 unlawful armed organizations. This is the term that is used under the WAPA, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, and there are 7 unlawful armed organizations which are proscribed under relevant section of the Unlawful Armed Prevention Activities Act. And out of the 7 proscribed armed organizations, 6 are Meitei armed organizations. And you'd find that unlike the Kuki quote-unquote terrorists, these 6 proscribed, banned, armed militant organizations based in the valley, which are now alarmingly activated in the course of this violence, in effect have been responsible in killing 275 security personnel between 2000 and 2023. In fact, this is the latest data which is compiled by the Zomi Students Federation by collating data from various sources of Union Home Ministry annual report and the South Asia Terrorism Portal, which is considered to be the most authoritative portal which records terrorist-related incidents of violence. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so according to these statistics, for example, between 2000 and 2023, there are instances of 555 incidents of attacks, both civilian and security, of which 275 security personnel got killed. These are Indian Central Paramilitary Force on duty in the state, who have been killed by these 6 proscribed or banned armed militant organizations. So if you square up the kind of data available on the ground, you'll find that this narrative is patently false and deeply problematic, because they do not square up with what is publicly available, right? So in that sense, in order to have justice, one of the requirements of justice is truth. As I wrote in the Hindu early on at the beginning of this outbreak of violence, that we should have the audacity to confront the truth about the nature and the cause of this violence. And in order to confront the truth and about the nature as well as cause of this violence, it is therefore imperative to look at some of this patently false narrative which has now become wide mass consumption. And one of the narrative, as I've already flagged, is the issue of illegal immigrants. This issue of illegal immigrants does not square up with existing public records. The state government report itself does not square up with what Biren Singh has done over the time. And on the issue of narco-terrorism, as I said, all communities are involved, and therefore you cannot accept selective targeting of a particular community in order to provide rational justification for marking out one as the demon, as it were, in the society, which in effect pose grievous, social, political, or national security destabilization. And the third is the issue of encroacher. So one of the important narrative that you get to hear is the cookies are encroachers of reserve forest or protected forest, as it were. So again, this is a problematic assumption as well as statement, precisely because if you look at the kind of protestation or resistance that the tribals have, is that the uti possidentis juris, which is the Latin word which is translated as actual possessor of law, possessor under the law. If you have a land which you possess, international legal principle recognize you as the legitimate owner. And in tribal lands in Manipur, government public ownership of land is rather very limited, except the proper forest reserve. We call it reserve forest. And these reserve forests, protected forests, wildlife sanctuaries have to be declared by following established protocol or established procedure. That is to say that if a particular land is to be demarcated as a reserve forest, protected forest, wildlife sanctuary, so on and so forth, then the local authorities consent, or the district administration, and above that, the Hill Areas Committee has to be notified about such intent of the state, and for that matter, the central government, of declaring a particular chunk of forest as reserve forest, protected forest, so on and so forth. The bone of contention here, for example, is the Churachandpur Khopum forest, which was declared in 1966 when Manipur was a union territory. And the contention is that since these Churachandpur Khopum reserve forests encompass something like 500 square kilometers, encompassing about 38 villages, there was a lot of contention about the way in which this was taken over, demarcated and declared as reserve forest by protected forest by the central government. So there was a lot of petition against the declaration of these 38 villages as protected forests, and there were several representations by these village chiefs between 1971 and 1988. As a result of which, a review was made, and the assistant settlement officer, which is the officer who is authorized to review or to declare void or lawful such delimitation of forest area as protected forest, in effect accepted the representation by 24 out of the 38 villages, and in effect kept them outside the ambit of Churachandpur Khopum forest. And this was in effect reviewed recently when Biren Singh in effect began to embark upon the war on narco-terrorism as well as the war on drugs, as it were. And in October 2022, Biren Singh government summarily declared null and void the exemptions given by the assistant settlement officer which exclude 24 out of the 38 villages which were encompassed by the Churachandpur Khopum forest project. And the government led by Biren Singh used this as an excuse, as a pretext to start what they called eviction drives, starting from K. Sonjang villages. And there was a huge lot of agitation, protests, as well as mobilization, because it was seen to be arbitrary, because Biren Singh sent bulldozer overnight, razed the whole village to the ground on the contention that it was inadmissible before the law. And this is also the time in which there was also a sense of restiveness or a sense of discrimination felt by the tribals, because the tribal felt that not only in the forest areas, but also in terms of place of worship, they had faced discrimination at the hands of the state government. And this became clearly plausible if you closely look at the series of reviews and final verdict given on the question of whether to regularize places of public worship by the state government, in which 188 Meitei Hindu temples were reviewed upon instruction by the Supreme Court. Remember that there was this case, State of Gujarat versus Union of India in 2009, and the Supreme Court directed all state government to review cases where places of worship are built on public land, whether they be reserved forest, protected forests, or other places, right? And as a result, the state government regularized all these 188 Meitei temples in Manipur, whereas it has not regularized a single tribal church in the state. And the uneven-handedness of the state did not stop there, and people took offense and felt that the state deliberately seeks to marginalize as well as push them to the corner, when on 11 April of this year, bulldozer suddenly emerged on 3 adjacent church building in East Imphal, and they were hardly given around less than 12 hours, to evacuate themselves. But despite the pleading that they should be allowed at least one single day so that they have ample time to evacuate their properties, they were not listened to. And what happened was, early in the morning, around 3 to 4 a.m., the state, with full security cordon in this church, because they anticipate that the tribals might violently revolt or protest against such bulldozing of these 3 churches on 11th April of this year, that they were razed to the ground, which again is in stark violation of the law, because according to the Public Eviction Act of 1972, you cannot evict or demolish public building without giving adequate time of 15 days. And after which, if there is appeal, it would take another, normal course as the law prescribed. But you cannot precisely demolish public buildings, forget about places of worship, in a period which proceed after sunset and before sunrise, which essentially means that you cannot execute any demolition drive in the dark. And because these 3 church buildings were destroyed in the dark, because the sun has not risen, right, at 3 or 3:30, the tribals felt that this is a deliberate political ploy to bulldoze the rights and entitlement of minorities, the tribals. Not so much to do with their Christian identity, but because they are considered to be at the mercy of the whims and fancies of a majoritarian government, which is increasingly aggressive about not tolerating any distinctiveness. So in that sense, this projection of the tribals as illegal encroachers who pose significant demographic as well as environmental threat to the state, in effect, is a very lopsided and deeply problematic assumption, because it, in effect, fueled a particular form of majoritarian politics which is dismissive of or disrespectful of minority rights, which are protected in the Constitution of India. So I think, therefore, knowledgeable or politically conscious citizens like us should confront the context in which all of these narratives are built up over time. And we should know the context in which these narratives are built up, used selectively and deliberately to target specific community as the other, right? Which in a sense, in effect, calls upon us our ethical as well as moral, forget about our political or civic responsibility, to stand up and call out or speak truth to power, as it were. And this becomes very important because in this era of fake news or falsehood, in fact, interestingly, I am at the receiving end of this false propaganda after having intervened on this violence. When I completed my 3-year tenure as the head of department at the Department of Political Science in University of Hyderabad here, the appointment of the next incumbent head is used by these, people to suggest that I had been forcibly removed by the University of Hyderabad because I had been spreading false propaganda. Someone has pointed out that, although you know the truth and you try to disseminate information that some of these false propaganda are indeed wrong, you are at the receiving end of that false propaganda, which I can correlate with me now. You see, the other false charge that I face, for example, which is ridiculous, is the fact that 2 days after I give my interview to Karan Thapar, one concerned citizen based in the valley, who is considered to be very close to the power establishment, filed an RTI to the chief electoral officer, and the chief electoral officer, in unusual effectiveness, provide whatever data he demanded of. But unfortunately, a very piecemeal and partial information was given based on 2005 electoral data. And that information that was given by the CEO of Manipur, in effect, evidently did not contain the name of my father, who passed 16 years before the publication of this 2005 electoral data. And these vigilante groups used that as an excuse to doubt my citizenship by saying that since my father's name is not there in 2005 electoral data, I and my family members must have obtained my electoral ID by fraud and manipulation. You can well imagine, and this is the kind of falsehood, misinformation or disinformation which is now used by so-called vigilante groups to target people who tend to speak truth to power. I'm not scared, actually. People thought that I might not oblige when HRF invited me to speak, but so long as you speak the truth and you have solid foundation on what you speak, we should not be scared. If you are silenced, which is what is being intended, I think that's how majoritarianism or totalitarian system works. And we should not allow that type of lies, falsehood, to silence us. And this is precisely why I thought that I should come today to speak before you and to highlight some of the issues for your consumption. I'll just take briefly another maybe 5 or 7 minutes so that I do not bore you with other so many things. The other thing on the issue of encroachment, you see, we have to be cognizant of the historical context in which the tribals or Adivasis or indigenous groups, as it were, because there is a deep problem about this indigenous debate. We begin to feel it very intimately now, because the question of indigeneity, although highly ethically as well as morally acceptable, can also become deadly problematic in place like Manipur, because one of the problem about the discourse on indigeneity in Manipur, which is used by the majority community, the Meiteis, and now the Tangkhuls and the Kabuis in Manipur, is that except the Nagas and the Nagas and the Meiteis, the Kukis and other groups are not indigenous to Manipur, which is a deeply problematic assertion, because after all, how do you fix the timeline to fix who is indigenous to a particular place? And I say this because if you look at the history of Manipur, for example, the Chaitharol Kumbaba, that is the royal chronicle, records that the Khongsai, which is a segment of the Kukis today, are already entered in the royal chronicle since the early 18th century, which does not in a sense testify to their settlement in that, because they might have even preceded. It's just a coincidence or happenstance that they entered, because royal chronicle, as they are, personal record of semi-autobiographic record of the achievements or of the conduct of the kings, happens to encounter the settlement of the Khongsai. It does not essentially establish the fact that they might live in this place much earlier than that. But if you look at different historical source, you'll find that the Valley Kingdom had not extended in the southern territory, right? And there is no sense of direct control, given that, Pemberton, for example, in 1835 records that the southern border of Manipur is independent, right? And this is the kind of political status that has been affirmed by subsequent colonial ethnographers. You name any one of them, right? So the contention that I raised, for example, in one of my pieces in the Tribune, for example, is that in 1883, remember that it is now more than 140 years, and 6 years after the pronouncement of what they call inner line reserve forest in the Assam Lusai Hills, now Mizoram. In 1883, after this inner line reserve forest was declared, 4 Lusai rubber tappers ventured into this particular territory, which are now encompassed by 509 odd square miles of inner line reserve. And the district commissioner of Kachar record that they were shot down like bats. They were shot down like bats. And this is a story, in effect, which this generation hardly knows about the historical context in which tribal owners of land, which under international legal principle, which uti possidentis juris, recognize them as the legitimate owner of land, suddenly becoming encroacher in their own land overnight because of the superimposition of laws, which does not consult nor obtain their consent from. And this is the context precisely that unravels not just in Manipur, but in other Adivasi areas, in other parts of India, and much more in Australia, in Canada, or you name it, wherever you have indigenous population living, that it is because of the politics of enclosure of the modern state that the tribal, the minority communities, sons of the soil, have been rendered as the problem creator, as it were. The owners of the land suddenly becoming overnight as the serious threat to the state, which is a misplaced, inversion of political discourse. And I think unless we know and historicize how the Kuki, the Zhou communities in Manipur, or in other parts of Telangana or Andhra Pradesh, in Orissa or Madhya Pradesh, that the Adivasis or the tribals become encroachers of government land overnight and confront them in accordance with what is now internationally accepted legal principle, uti possidentis juris, for example. You cannot possibly malign or selectively target in order to, justify genocidal attacks against such tribal Adivasis communities. And that is precisely why my argument is that initially there was an overwhelming sense that because despite the fact that Amit Shah early on established what is now known as buffer zones, we have no parallel of such kind elsewhere in India, that a segment, geographical segment are clearly divided between the hills and the plains, the Kuki dominated areas and the Meitei dominated areas, and you have a buffer zone which has to be zealously guarded by central paramilitary force under a semblance of what they called a unified security command. And this is deeply problematic, as I suggest in my articles, precisely because the idea of unified security command does not work on the ground, precisely because unless you have a semblance of formal injunction of Article 355, which the central government initially claimed it does, but unfortunately that has become a part of the disinformation campaign, because the PIB website has never carried or authenticated that Article 355 had indeed been imposed from the very outset. And there is a prevarication on the part of central government to superimpose president's rule. In fact, there are precedent in the case of Punjab when Gulbari Singh was the chief minister. Indira Gandhi, in effect, ensured that he was replaced when he probably could not maintain law and order in the state. But the BJP deliberately prevaricate on owning direct supervision and control, and that is precisely where I argue that despite this idea of buffer zones or kind of containerizing hill communities to insulate from offensive attacks from the militant organization, either in complicity with the state police force, unless you have president's rule or unless you have full empowerment of central paramilitary force, either by way of imposing Article 355 and Article 356 or by imposing AFSPA, Armed Force Special Powers Act, in the valley areas, you do not have a possibility or prospect of establishing a semblance of peace in a durable basis. And this becomes particularly pertinent because you would see that the kind of discourse on both sides of the divides are increasing in terms of waging war against each other. You never heard of two communities declaring that they openly wage war against one another. And one side of the community which is at war is either fully supported by or is fully condoned in its activities by the state, because despite the fact that more than 6,000 automatic rifles had been handed over to the valley-based insurgent groups and more than 6 lakh rounds of live ammunition handed over them, hardly 1,000 had been recovered, right? 1,000 automatic rifles. That means more than 5,000 automatic rifles are still in the hands of these armed militant and vigilante groups who are now openly declaring war against a particular community in the foothills. And the state, in effect, condones by not taking swift, immediate action against perpetrators of violence. And this becomes increasingly scary and deeply lethal and problematic in the most recent outbreak of violence in Palel. I don't know how many of you follow the reportage by Grishma Kuthar, a Chennai-based journalist come lawyer who has been stationed in Kangpopi in Lamka or Churachandpur quite extensively, and she gives a blow-by-blow account of what really transpired on the ground. And she suggests that, for example, in early September, when another
mobs in thousands were galvanized or mobilized under the cover of, armed militants suspected to be UNLF or PLA based in the valley. They camouflage in police commando or police uniforms and climb up the hills and start attack from the hills. And this is the first time which in effect marked a strategic shift in the way offensive attacks are launched against the Kukis. And in order to cover up this attack, in order to facilitate these attacks, surrounding villages, women and Meira Parbis in thousands were mobilized so that they could forestall any possibility of central paramilitary force reaching and neutralizing those offensive strikes. And you find that as a result of this security scuffle between the central paramilitary force on the one side and the Meira Paibis, who in fact give security cover to the militant armed organization to launch offensive strike against the Kukis in the Pelan region, you have clear evidence where, had it not been for the complicity or active condonement of the state, these armed militant organization based in the valley who are declared unlawfuls would not have been mobilized and weaponized to launch relentless attacks against the foothills. And if these buffer zones really work on the ground, and if security personnel deployed from the central government, which is more than 60,000 now, are fully empowered to maintain law and order, then you would have already had a semblance of peace and stability. And I'll end my talk here. Thank you so much for your patient listening.
The day is not God, you are not equal, even not your human, as situation unfolds. Medialism in dreaming, near that God can do. Medialism in dreaming, in condemnation of brutal rape of women in Manipur. Thank you, sir. Please kindly.
Lights on. This side.
Okay, thank you to the question that you asked. Is there a tension or potential conflict between self-determination and development or developmental agenda or developmental project of the state? I suggest that you read this very interesting article on this by Sanjeev Barua, which is titled Nationalizing Space, Cosmetic Regional Federal Order in Northeast India. And a counterpoint to that is by Berenice Guyot Richard, which is State or Nation Building in the Northeast. I think it depends upon how do you look at self-determination and how and to what extent can this self-determination be accommodated within the framework of or the paradigm of the developmental state. As we know, self-determination has both internal and external dimension, and it depends on which particular dimension you have in mind. If you have self-determination with a potential sovereignty or full-blown independent state demand, this is problematic in India because the 16th Constitution Amendment Act proscribed any individual or organization which espouse sovereignty, in the sense that if you challenge as an individual or organization the sovereignty or territorial integrity of India, you would be liable to be banned under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. So then the question obviously that you have to ask is that what are the internal self-determination that might be potentially be negotiated or set within the framework of Indian political system in ways which is amenable to the developmentalist project of the Indian state nation. I think to that extent, one of the striking exemplars which I work on as a part of my Fulbright project when I was a Fulbrighter at UPenn was to look at the case of Nagaland, for example, to suggest that even independentist demands can be negotiated and sovereign demand could be set by creative constitutionalism, which Article 371A envisages. Because if you look at carefully Article 371A, it has the ingredients of negotiated and shared sovereignty to the extent that Nagaland Assembly remains the only assembly across the Indian states to have the right to make it non-applicable any law made by the Indian Parliament on matter pertaining to land and resources, social and customary laws, religious practices, so and so forth. And this is significant because according to, say for example, Section 2 of the Mines and Minerals Development Regulation Act 1957, the Union Parliament has the occupied field when it comes to mines and minerals, which is to say, suggests that the Union law, by invoking national interests, could use its eminent domain to claim mines and minerals of national interest and could exclusively appropriate it for nationalist development. But in the case of Nagaland Assembly could invoke Article 371 to not make this section applicable to the state. And this is an interesting provision which in effect has been supported by some of the leading legal luminaries of India from the 1980s, from R.C. Sarkar, Muhammad Hidayatullah, and you have Arvind Subramaniam or Soli Sorabjian, all endorsing the right of Nagaland under Article 371 to have exclusive negotiated and shared sovereignty on matters pertaining to mines and minerals. And you know that in around 2010 to 2012, there was this heated exchange between the union government and the state government of Nagaland on this potential conflict between Naga's sovereign claims over mines and minerals on the one side and the occupied field of the Union Parliament. And it seems that there are tangible or plausible tensions eminent in this, which is precisely where I suggest, for example, that some of these negotiated agreement, the 16-point agreement which laid the foundation of Article 371, should be declared as the basic structure, and there should be possibility of exceptional constitutional status that was given to address.
Excuse me, time is
I'll finish. And in that sense, I think these tensions are there, which are immanent and embedded in the constitution, but there are also possibility of reconciling and balancing in ways that cohere with India's sovereignty as well as territorial integrity. Thank you.